Hi, West Ham fans. We're going to do something a little bit different today. We have Toby here with us today. As you may remember, he did the video with us about and Postecoglou, who is now at Tottenham. So,
bastards.
How about you let us know what we're going to be talking about today, why we're here, because this is your idea. So brains are going to be melted, not just mine, but probably everyone else's as well, listening to this one. But tell us the idea behind this one, Toby, and then we'll dive into what it is. The problem going to be for West Ham next season.
Look, so we've all been spending a lot of the since the season finished, looking at what's going to happen with our squad. Where are we going to go as a club, and how are we going to piece everything together to improve things, particularly with key sale of Declan Rice. But I see a lot of people talking about as fans how much we need to focus on homegrown players, and it is beyond key to everything that we will do this season. And with our dear friend Timmy coming in and bringing hopefully a planned, structured sort of approach to recruitment, I just wanted to get us to talk about just how challenging it's going to be to build that up, and also to perhaps put to bed some myths and some ideas and some and get people to just understand how much of a tight struggle this is actually going to be for the club. Where in previous seasons we have come in with our homegrown quota pretty comfortably every season. This is the first season we've had where this is going to have to be the central focus for all recruitment, no matter the position.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we all know, we have now got ourselves a new technical director, not director of football. Let's be clear, not a director of football. We have a technical director, known by many. I say many who can't be asked to try and pronounce his last name. That's Timmy. But Tim Steidten has come into West Ham. So he started officially yesterday. So he's now officially West Ham's technical director. His role is to be the head of our recruitment and our scouting, to essentially bring in a much more data-led process and understanding and philosophy to West Ham, and to guide West Ham arguably not only just into the present, because let's face it, we have been working probably 10 years behind most clubs in many ways, but also then to guide us into the future and to create a structure which is going to make us be run professionally. It's going to help us within the market to identify players earlier, to ensure that we don't do things like we did with Vanana, where we then questioned whether he was worth a wage, because why would you go for a player if you're then going to question if they ask for significant money? Which is unbelievable that was a thought process. And now we're in a position where we're potentially looking to go back in for said player and having to pay him more than what we would have had to have paid him, because again, we can't make a decision because we are not informed. So Timmy obviously has a very big job this summer in one, if he's going to be the man in control, to find players that Moyes is going to be comfortable enough with, but also players that ultimately have no bearing or even take no concern in what Moyes says. Because if Moyes isn't here next year, and at the moment you would suggest that is the case, he hasn't got a new contract, no talks of contract, it would be foolish of West Ham to invest in David Moyes if he isn't seen past this year, and bringing in players that are going to be a financial burden to the club for future seasons for a manager that maybe will not fancy them. So we have to be very smart. And whilst David Moyes should be part of the conversation, he shouldn't be probably the person leading it. It should be Steidten, because he is here for the long term. He is going to be the one wanting to bring a certain style to West Ham, a certain type of player to West Ham. Therefore, you have to argue that Moyes should rightly be a voice, but not the man deciding. So obviously that's one of his really difficult jobs. There's a real big specificity as the player you need to get with David Moyes. And we know the types of players that have been linked. They are Premier League based. They are the likes of James Ward-Prowse, etc. Now, to move forward, to pass that kind of point, Steidten's incredibly difficult job is to manage our 25-man squad. And had we not been in Europe, this would be a far simpler task. But as we are in Europe, we're in a very difficult position. Now, first off, if we just kind of recant as to what our current structure is, what our current squad is. So currently, we meet the homegrown quota. We have 8 players currently, which is perfect for the quota. You have to have 8 homegrown players for the Premier League. You also need to have 8 homegrown players for Europa League, which is the European competition we're in next year. Also, players under the age of 21 in the Premier League are not limited. You can have those as an extension to your 25-man squad. For example, if we was to buy Alex Scott, technically speaking, he does not need to be registered for the Premier League. None of our youth players currently would also need to be registered because they are youth players. They're under the age of 21. They can be in addition to the 25-man squad. From a non-homegrown perspective, you can have 17. This applies in both the Europa League and the Premier League. We're currently at 15 because obviously we've lost Manuel Lanzini. And obviously this is our list of players within here. Again, we have a terrible age in our squad as well. It's around about 28.38, I believe, as our average age, which puts us as the highest average age in the Premier League. So there is work to be done. And I will bring you back in a moment, Toby. The last thing is, the other concern is, obviously, we do have 15 non-homegrown players. We have 8 homegrown players, 3 of those being youth in Coventry, Anang, and Ben Johnson. Obviously, we're going to be losing Declan Rice, who is obviously our 4th. And you need 4, by the way, 4 youth players to be part of, or club-trained players, part of your European qualification or registration. And the issue is that when you look at players potentially rumoured to be going or players that may be moved on, of our homegrown list, we have Antonio, who's obviously been angling for a move. Flynn Downs has been linked with a move to Southampton. Ben Johnson and Coventry are also probably having secure futures. They're both 2 of our youth players. So if they go, we only have 1 youth player within our squad next year, which is incredible to have only that. And from the outbounds, Ariola's been linked to be going out. Vlasic, Kera, Souček, Fornals, Scamacca. It's a massive overhaul to do that. And it would be probably quite a daunting task. If we didn't have the Premier League, I think it would be a very simple task. I don't think anyone would have any qualms, any problems, any issues with that. But I think when we then add in the factor of the Europa League, it becomes very difficult and a very awkward proposition. Would you not say?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's important to say we're both obviously completely delighted with being able to be back in Europe. It's a huge thing, but it does just complicate how we build a list and what we do. And I think there's one important skill and challenge for Timmy coming in that you didn't list, and that's the vital role of having a Gaiksa Mendieta lookalike at the club. Because without that, I mean, what sort of club are you really trying to be? No, look,
I should completely digress. What a player Mendieta, especially at Valencia. Incredible.
Loved him, and we know how much Middlesbrough fans idolise him as well. But so look, and let's hope Timmy brings that sort of level of love and technical skill to the club. But no, look, it is a huge thing this year, and I think even when you add the likes of, say, Danny Ings, that we know doesn't fit the Moyes system, and we know there's got to be a question mark there as well. Of those lists of homegrown players, I think the only 2 that you could perhaps be 100% sure on, or as close to that as you possibly can be, would be Jarrod Bowen and Joseph Anang. Because I think as a third place, your third goalkeeper role, it has to be somebody that is homegrown. That's the there's a reason why the clubs across the league are doing that, to use that benefit, and the fact that he's club trained just means that I don't see Anang going anywhere. Outside of that, you have to unfortunately put a question mark against the rest of them, and how we make the choices of who stays. And who's looking at new contracts and what sort of players we're bringing in really has to be built around how many of those question marks might be potentially moving.
Yeah, and obviously, for those who don't know what homegrown means and wondering why we keep talking about homegrown players, this is essentially how it's described in the Premier League. So a homegrown player means a player who, irrespective of nationality or age, has been registered with any club affiliated to the Football Association or the Football Association of Wales for a period, continuous or not, of entire seasons or 36 months before his 21st birthday or the end of the season during which he turns 21. So, for example, as we say, Alex Scott is a homegrown player. However, technically, when we talk about the Premier League, he does not need to be registered because he is under the age of 21. Other players that we have, again, so if we talk about our youth system, Mubama, again, would not need to be registered. He is homegrown. However, we do not need to register him. Also, it can be, technically speaking, is a youth player. But again, under the age of 21, when it comes to now then the registration for Europa League, it becomes very difficult. And the reason being is if we look at the rules here, so this is the registration rules, you must have 4 club trained players. So these are players that have come through your youth system. So the likes of Ben Johnson, obviously Declan Rice previously, Joseph Anang, Connor Coventry. Those are all players that are technically classed as club trained. You need 8 locally trained. These are the likes of Jared Bowen, Flynn Downs, etc. These are players that have been within the country or within the association. And again, technically comes slightly within that association piece. So you can have 8 players which are then homegrown. Then you have the ability to have 17 non-club players, all again locally trained. What this is then referring to is the fact that you have to have your 8 homegrown players, and then you're going to have up to, say, 17 players that aren't technically within the bounds of the homegrown qualification. Now, this is where it gets interesting, and this is why when we talk about having a 25-man squad, we start to go into a level that becomes a bit tricky. If a club has fewer than 8 locally trained players in its squad, then the maximum number of the players on the list is reduced accordingly. So, for instance, if West Ham could only register 6 players from that are technically viewed as locally trained, West Ham could only then register a squad of 23 because they need to allow 2 additional slots for homegrown players to be part of it, or as essentially maybe say 2 under 21 players to be available within that class, but they can't be actually part of the qualification. Are your heads hurting yet? I assume they probably are, but this is the problem that West Ham face, is that it's not just as simple as we can have a 25-man squad, because we have to have that 8 of trained within the UK or Wales. And of that 8, 4 of them have to be youth players. If we do not meet that quota in any way, shape or form, you have to adjust your squad accordingly. So if West Ham were to move on Coventry, if they were to move on Ben Johnson, then we have only 1 player who is club trained. We would then have to remove 3 players from our overall qualification. And I know people here sitting going, what about Mubama? Mubama would be on list B, not list A. There are 2 lists you have. List B would be the players like Mubama, Ollie Charles, Freddie Potts, etc. Those players will be on list B. You may also think, well, what about Callum Marshall? Callum Marshall cannot be on list B because he has not been at West Ham for 2 consecutive seasons, and he hasn't trained within an association for the past 3 years. So it's in the UK or even Wales. Therefore, he would, if we were to register, say, Callum Marshall, would have to go into list A as a foreign player. And I believe even Alex Scott technically would have to go in as a non-club player, because whilst he is under 21 and whilst he is homegrown, he hasn't been at West Ham for more than 2 years, therefore cannot be registered under the Europa League rules as a homegrown player to be added to our 8 listing. Again, it's a head scratcher. It's very difficult. And again, this is based on our understanding. We may be slightly wrong, but based on our understanding, this is the law of the land. And someone like Alex Scott, for instance, can't just be utilised as an under-21 player and therefore doesn't have to be registered. I believe the rules are slightly changed and slightly skewed on that now. So it's not quite like Football Manager. If you have an under-21 player, that he can just not be registered, and you can kind of use those under-21 players to make up the rest of your squad. So, yeah, as we say,
let's give everyone just a moment to breathe, because just going through all those things this is. If you want to spend a day losing your mind, go to the Europa website and have a look at the registration rules. It's a great read. It is fantastic, particularly for all of those of you suffering from insomnia. It is a great solution to a lot of that. But the thing that I think that maybe the best way to go through some of this would be using some examples of players that people often think might be homegrown, but perhaps aren't. So, for example, everyone often used to think that when he played for us, Robert Snodgrass was a homegrown player, but he wasn't. He was trained in Scotland, and Scotland isn't under the English FA or under the Wales FA or Irish FA as well. So they weren't. So Scottish players have to be trained in England for at least 2 years between the ages of 16 and by the time they turn 21.
15 and 21, they've dropped
15. Thank you. Sorry, there we go. So yeah, it means that you've then got and the other classic example is often Eric Dyer. So even though, you know, an English international, obviously plays for the worst club imaginable, but before all that, he was trained in Portugal. And so he didn't spend 2 years being trained in the English FA, Irish FA, or W.
Over the age of 20, so technically he couldn't qualify because he couldn't have those 3 consecutive seasons. So again, this is where Steidten can be incredibly important to West Ham, is because if he can bring in 17-year-olds are kind of difficult to bring in because of obviously other rules and regulations. But essentially, if Steidten is able over the next 2 seasons to bring in a selection of 18-year-olds or 19-year-olds to the Premier League or into West Ham, then over obviously the next 3 years, technically, if we're still in Europe or we qualify for Europe, they can then be classed as homegrown players, provided they are at West Ham for that 3-year duration. And they were only, say, if they went out on loan, they was only outside of the FA for 1 season.
Yep.
So, say, for example, we went and bought a young 18-year-old from Leverkusen. By the time they're 21, they will be a homegrown player. They will be asked. Technically, they could also, I believe, be classed as a youth player as well, a club-trained player, because of it's between the ages of 15 and 21. So that is Tim Steidten's also thing, is to go and find these young 18-year-olds. And again, another lovely rule by UEFA is that you can only sign 6 under 21 players in a season. So again, it stops teams from circumventing essentially those rules from them, because obviously clubs could then just go and buy an inordinate amount of under 21 players and then look to kind of bring them through. So as we say, it's a really, really tough job that Steidten's got, because whatever way we kind of cook it at the moment is this potential that come the start of the season, come start of the Europa League, there are going to be 1 or 2 players that we actually have to go to and say, I'm sorry, but you can't be registered for the competition.
Yeah, and that's hugely, it affects the way that young players see the club. It affects the way that, you know, the club works. And I suppose the other thing we need to sort of keep in mind with all this is, so, you know, why do we care if we register, say, 23 players for Europa League versus a full squad of 25 players? But we've seen under Moyes in the last few seasons a reluctance to use players and change them around. And last season in the Conference League was the first season where we genuinely saw a wide array of players being used. And what ends up happening means that we can rotate, keep players fresher. We can make sure that when we get down to those key phases of, you know, quarterfinals, semi-finals and finals, we've got a team that is ready to play, been playing consistently in some way, shape or form, afresh, and have the energy to see out a full season. So it can literally be the difference between, getting through some of those knockout phases and not for it. But and whilst we all know that Moyes will be limited in the sort of players he selects, I think we do have to give him credit for the European runs for the last 2 seasons and how effective the use of the squad has been. But he's been able to do that because we've had a base layer of homegrown players that we can use. We've had players from the under 23s and under 18s that have been with us for 2 seasons and are ready to sort of start taking some of those opportunities and coming in as subs or coming in and playing games when we're comfortable in parts of the group stages. And it means that we then get seen across the world for being a club that develops players, and that's fundamentally who we are as a club. So it's vital that we get this balance right. It's vital that we look to try and encourage players from within our club and our training to come through and make it on that big stage.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why we've advocated youth for so long on this channel, because had the likes of, say, Freddie Potts, Mubama, maybe even Gideon Kadua been given chances, also as this George Urphy, for example. Those types of players, had they been given more opportunities last season, or any opportunity last season, you could argue, because I think Mubama only really played less than 200 minutes of first-team football last season. That's not really development in any way, shape or form. And I know people will say, well, we had Scamacca, we had Antonio, we had Ings, but we also had all 3 of those players in and out of form at times. And also
injuries as well. All of them went through injury phases for it. And that's often more likely with a older squad. Another thing that we keep banging on about for it. But a classic example that where we could have been in a slightly stronger position, right, would be Agialese, who we know last season to Europa League, he performed incredibly well against Zagreb in that final game and showed that he was ready for more senior football. We went through the end of the Premier League where our form declined massively. We had injury concerns galore. We could not find centre-backs or left-backs to save ourselves. And he was a guy who'd shown that he was ready to get an opportunity. And now I'm not going to sit there and say that he's going to be a world-class player or things like that, but he is club trained. He was ready for first team football, and I think his season at Sunderland, although the end of it has been affected by an injury, has well and truly shown that he was ready to step up at a senior level and perform very, very well.
We've seen Edward do also equally well at Sunderland. Again, we're not saying that these players should be part of our first team. They should be there. But again, we've always got to be mindful of you need club trained, you need homegrown. And you could argue last year, well, we had enough in the homegrown. We had nothing there. But again, a loan deal, a successful loan deal would have probably been a better idea to then reassess every season as to, now, do we let this player go? I know they made reference to creating pathways for players to come through. However, they've made a pathway and who's come through out of taking the slot that arguably LSA was taken, maybe the slot that Ekwa would have been taken. Which players have come through? So whilst the point raised that it's about creating pathways, we're not seeing those pathways being utilised. And you could argue maybe Potts was the person to come through instead of Ekwa, but again, he made a few minutes against Larnaca. Didn't play since then, when we probably could have rotated him in 1 or 2 times. And again, it would just, when we talk about that homegrown list for UEFA, had, say, 1 or 2 of those been given a bit more of a chance, we could go in quite comfortably and go, well, maybe it is okay if, say, Coventry goes. Because whilst we wouldn't register Potts would take the slot that we would have had to have given to Coventry as part of that 4 and part of our 8. Same with Mubama, for instance, giving him more chance. Again, whilst we wouldn't have technically registered him in list A, he'd be part of list B. But again, it would be a player that we would be confident in that, again, say if Antonio went, he comes in and covers Antonio's slot. And we would have technically our 4 youth players. And we would still have our 8. But that's the problem. We're not, because we don't integrate these players enough, because we've maybe allowed players to go who are above the age of 21, who potentially could have been kept around as a decent squad player and kept maybe some of the aging players. We've not completely shot ourselves in the foot, but we've made complications in how we go forward.
We've made it harder for ourselves fundamentally, and when we talk about being the academy, and I know that's very much an advertising thing these days, but for fans, it's a vital part of the the makeup and DNA of the club. So we shouldn't pay lip service to that. We need to actually see development and improvement in those things. I mean, I just want to give you a counter example of what you can do as an option. If you look at Manchester City, now that they very rarely list a full 8 players for homegrown players for the Premier League. They very often will have their 17 internationals and perhaps 5, 6 homegrown players and leave spaces available. And then they, when they register for Champions League, which they're in instead of Europa League, the rules and the requirements are exactly the same. The Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League, I should say. So all that is consistent as long as you're in Europe. And they have. It's one of the reasons why you'll see players like Cole Palmer or Foden when he was coming through, or Iheanacho when he was younger coming through. They were given time because they were coming through the Manchester City Academy, had been with the club for more than 2 years, but were not yet 21 and were getting opportunities in the Europa League. And you've seen many clubs across Europe use those European League games, particularly the group games, as an opportunity to blood young players and give them minutes and develop them. And all of those players for Manchester City will eventually either have already or will eventually be important players in their squad in the future. Ideally, for the structure for your homegrown players, but specifically in the Premier League, you want as many of those homegrown players to be key players within your team that are going to play regularly and play regular minutes. So, the Jared Bowen-esque sort of type player, much like we've had with Declan Rice. Declan Rice, not only was he, captain, our best player, and all those sorts of things, but the fact that he was homegrown to us is not only just a matter of pride, but it is a registration huge benefit and a key piece to building a squad as a result of that. So it's if you don't have those foundation markers and those foundation stones for building a squad, you end up having to spend either a hell of a lot of money getting in homegrown players, which we know are more expensive just because every club in England needs them. Every club in England has more money than the rest of Europe. And that you need to have a base number of them. And there's only so many out there. Which I know sounds ridiculous, and there's probably 500,000 registered English players or something across all the leagues and across all the competitions. But you want to get the best players of those, and so that's why they always hold such a premium for it, because everyone has to have them. And so we've been linked with players like Harvey Barnes recently, and so Harvey Barnes would come in and be a key player for the club in that he's likely to be in the first team 11 or very close there too, and he is that homegrown player who's been playing in the right competitions for long enough and is over 21. There's those sorts of players are the ones you want, but to get those players, as we know, it's $30 million, $40 million, pound to do that. So it becomes an expensive exercise when you have to replace those sorts of players. So you need to have a development plan for those young players coming through to reduce your spending and mean that you're not going to have to spend the earth just to keep a team registered so that you can be eligible and have a chance of continuing to progress in Europe season on season.
Absolutely. And just to kind of make this the last point and cover off on that, you made the point about you need to have key players within your homegrown list. You need to have players that are essentially vital cogs to your machine. And, one of those cogs that is vital to that machine here is Michail Antonio. He's looking to go. I haven't obviously included Declan Rice in this because there's no point. We know he's going. Coventry and he's obviously in his last year of his contract, likely not to be here. He's a youth player. He is key to our qualification, our registration, essentially, because we have to have 4. Ben Johnson is another one. Hence why we keep going back in for another contract. Whilst people don't rate him, that's fine, but you also need squad players and you need players that help you to get into that qualification registration piece. He is another vital player in that regard. Simply just replacing him to say bring in Max Aarons, whilst it gives us a homegrown quota, it doesn't resolve the issue of having to develop your own, the club-trained player. This is why we've constantly said, or I've constantly said, if you're looking to develop homegrown, or if you're looking at homegrown market, you have to develop your own. You have to be very clear and very much driven in which to drive to create your own players. You at least have to have 4 or 5 players, in my opinion, who are created by the club to ensure that if you are in Europe, you always meet those registrations, and then you can cherry pick the best other homegrown players. And then for the majority of your squad, which I think you have to do, is you then go into Europe because it's cheaper. There's better talent. You're not paying as much money. Buying the likes of Harvey Barnes is great. It's smart, intelligent work to do because you can potentially not only resale value eventually, but also he meets the quota of homegrown and ensures, again, we are cherry picking the best of the homegrown talent. And that's what we need to do. We need to develop a core of good young players. We have the base of that in our under 18s. And I think this is the great thing about having Tim Steidten, is that he is a great advocate for it. You just need to look at the fact that he was involved in the buy for Florian Wirtz for about £200,000 or €200,000 when Kai Havertz was being looked at as being sold, which they sold for, 80 million to Chelsea. He was a key person saying, that's fine, he can go. We've got a player in the youth team. We've got this kid who's coming through. You play him, he will resolve any of those problems of getting rid of Havertz. And he did. He got rid of Havertz, and it was a simple transition because, again, you have an advocate at the top level and managers who are willing in which to give time and development to those young players. So ultimately, there is going to need to be an adaptation from David Moyes because he's going to have to look more internally at the development of our own youth if we want to be continually in these European competitions, or otherwise we are going into it with one hand tied behind our back because of those registration rules. So we need to be far more, determined to produce our own, far more aware of the quality we bring in from a homegrown perspective. Because again, if it's not the quality, then we are restricting what we can do in the international market, and we don't want to go into competitions where we potentially can't register a player. But yeah, we're going to end it there because it's been a longer one today. Obviously, it's been a lot of kind of brain churning kind of information and the horrible permutations that there are with those registration rules. But whilst we're saying this isn't all negative, no. We have an incredibly good person at the helm now in Tim Steidten. Again, if you're not aware of who he is, go do some research on him. We've also done a video on him as well. There's been other channels have done. Go kind of read up on him. He sounds like an incredible kind of guy, but also from a perspective of what he's brought in at Leverkusen and Werder Bremen beforehand, it's incredibly exciting because when he gets a hit or a home run on a player, you're talking a 50, 60, 70 million pound player without any question. And that's a 60 million pound player that plays in the Bundesliga. You extrapolate that to the Premier League, you probably add another 10, 15, maybe even 20 million on top of that because of the power and the money within the Premier League. But yeah, any last thoughts, Toby, before we go?
So, and I love how much I understand why everyone focuses on Timmy's ability to grow players that have incredible value. Whilst I understand the monetary focus, perhaps as useful focus is that these players are not only worth that much, but bring a huge level of quality, ability, and talent to the field where it can then get results. He brings teams consistently up the ladder and make sure that they're competing with younger players with technical ability, with speed. He brings such a level of talent and focus to the way that he builds the squad. I think it's an incredible coup for West Ham to get him in, and I think it will then make us a more attractive club to managers, to players, and help us develop a hell of a lot. The last thing I want to say is the important date for everyone to keep in their minds is the 1st of January 2002. Every player born before then is considered a homegrown player as long as they've been playing, as we're saying, within these leagues at that time. If it's after that date, they're not yet registered. So for a lot of people, that means that they're 22 years old or things like that. But just use that as a basis to try and figure out if a English player or if a player that's been trained in England is a homegrown player. That's the sort of starting point. And yeah, if you want your brain melted, have a look at that fun Europa League website for all the registration rules. It's amazing.
It is definitely a doozy. But yeah, everyone, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. As ever, please do like, please do subscribe. Obviously, follow us on Twitter as well. We are on there. I know there are some fun and games going on with Twitter at the moment, but again, please do follow us in there. And as I say, please do subscribe. Please, it does do us a wonderful thing. And to be honest, in the last 28 days, it has been phenomenal. Over like 200 subscribers have joined the channel. We're slowly but surely eking our way up to 1,000. So absolutely thankful to every one of you who does follow us. If you don't follow us, but you've watched this video, again, thank you for at least watching. Please do subscribe. And yeah, let's see what the Pearl Diver, as he is known, can do for West Ham. And let's see what the 25 squad is come the end of the window. So thanks a lot, everyone. We'll see you again very soon.